This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. In this episode, I'm joined once again by permaculture designer and author Pippa Chapman to explore how beauty, productivity, and wildlife-friendly principles can all thrive together in the garden. We dive into her creative approach, the ideas behind her excellent new book on planting design, and how small, thoughtful changes can transform any space into a resilient, edible ecosystem.
I started off actually doing a degree in sculpture many years ago, and my plan was to be an art teacher. But when that didn't quite work out as planned, I kind of rethought everything, went back to live with my parents for a bit, and I was just helping my mum out with the garden. And just thought, actually, I would really love to do this for a job every day. I couldn't think of anything better. So I went and got a job in a garden centre, which then really sort of fast-tracked my plant knowledge. And after that, I managed to get a job as a gardener and then promoted to head gardener to a large local estate, which I absolutely loved being in a garden all day, every day. But the garden that I was looking after, they wanted, moss-free bowling green lawns, and they had they wanted all the paths and everywhere spraying with weed killer all the time. And, when I was younger, when I first started there, I just thought, well, this is what you have to do in horticulture. This is what people expect. And then I think over time, I've read a few books and met a few interesting people who were doing more sort of ecological, organic gardening, I realised that actually there was an alternative, there was another way. And I was lucky enough to then, I suppose it was a bit of a backward step at the time, but to go from being a head gardener to a trainee with the RHS at Harlow Carr in Harrogate, where they were really doing a lot of interesting, sustainable practices in gardening before a lot of the other RHS gardens were doing it, really. And I just learned it was such an amazing year of practical horticulture. Every week I would rotate round a different department, whether it was the Alpine House or the Productive Garden or the Woodland. And I just learnt so much about such a huge range of subjects in a year that when I left, I thought there's no way that I can ever go back to the supposed conventional style of horticulture. And so I set up my own, with my husband, we set up a fully organic garden maintenance business.
So is your sculpture and artistic background, does that hold you in good stead when you do the design side of it? Because, obviously you do a lot of planting plans and you're doing a lot of manipulation of space and planning and setting out, drawing, that kind of thing. Has that all helped, having that background?
Yeah, I think it has. And I think for a while I perhaps left the creative side behind a little bit. And I think over the last few years, particularly when I was working at Esholt Hall Gardens, which was a Yorkshire water site where I got to design and build a permaculture garden, I really felt like my creativity came alive again. We did a lot of sort of willow sculptures and used different natural materials, but in really interesting and creative ways. And so since then, I think my gardens have become a bit more sort of sculptural, full of interesting forms and shapes. I think when I first got into permaculture gardening, I felt a bit like it all had to be very functional, that it had to be functional for providing food and creating kind of ecosystem, and that actually maybe the aesthetics of it was not important because, that wasn't producing a yield, that wasn't helping wildlife, the wildlife don't care what it looks like. And I think over time, I've really come to realise that actually the joy that we get out of how a garden looks, the way that it makes us feel when we sit in it or when we work in it, is actually just as important as all the other yields. So I've definitely started bringing that creativity back into my work over the last few years.
And that's a really good thing, I think, because a lot of people probably do think, permaculture gardens, forest gardens, don't necessarily look pretty, they're productive, as you say. And that's a shame, because that doesn't have to be the case, and it doesn't have to be the case with wildlife gardens. So when you've got your design eye in and you're posing an actual design on it that works for people and works aesthetically, then I think it's great, because you can sell it more easily to people. And that's what I really liked about this book. So thinking about the book, obviously I interviewed you before for your backyard forest garden book, and this one is Permaculture Planting Design. So how are they different? And I'm going to ask you the sort of predictable thorny question, what's the difference between a forest garden and a permaculture garden? But you've now written the books on them, so hopefully you can shed some light.
Yeah, so I think that forest gardens fit into the kind of bigger umbrella of permaculture gardens, but not all permaculture gardens are forest gardens. So I think that whilst my preferred way of gardening and growing food and other, medicinal plants is in the form of a forest garden, I think I wanted to write a book that didn't put that constraint on the designs, that I didn't need to fill a book full of forest garden designs, that it could be open up to, some wider designs that maybe didn't include the tree and shrub layers, because not everybody wants that within their garden, and that's fine. So when I wrote my first book, it was very much to introduce the concept of forest gardening to people who maybe hadn't thought that it was possible for them to have it because they have a smaller garden. Quite often when we think forest garden, we think you need sort of half an acre or more to fit that in. So I wanted to sort of share my experiences and my experiments and adventures in forest gardening in my first book. In my second book, I really felt like one of the things that I get asked all the time is, what plants should I grow together? Have you got any examples? I just don't know where to start. So I thought actually it'd be really nice to provide not necessarily designs that you're going to lift out of the book and put straight into your garden. They're more meant as inspiration, where you might be able to look at them and get an idea of some different plant combinations that you can try out. But also I've explored all the different yields that you can get from a permaculture garden as well. So not just food, but there's designs, sort of healing gardens based around well-being and herbal teas and skincare and things like that. There's a garden design based all around craft, so growing your own natural dye plants or plants for weaving and making twine, things like that. Then there's also designs that are based around like just the joy of plants. So there's one which is totally different to what you'd expect, I suppose, from a normal forest garden, but it's a tropical style one. So plants with big leaves and bright colours, so that those of us who the aesthetics is really important as well, can still have fun and play with plants in the garden and still practice permaculture.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, because yes, they are beautiful, but also they're very functional, the things that you've designed and plotted in your book. And do you think that's going to become more pressing as we move forward? Because personally, I do worry a bit about kind of food supplies, and I also think of ways to try and reduce my consumerism. So having these productive gardens, I think, has got to be the way forward. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm the same, really. I think food insecurity is a huge problem globally, but particularly in the UK as well. But there are so many people who have gardens and could turn them into productive gardens without them looking like an allotment. So I think that was sort of part of what I had in my mind when I was writing this book and creating the designs within it, was that, if people didn't want to compromise, they didn't want to dig up their existing garden and just have rows of vegetables, which is completely understandable. That's not for everybody. Whilst, I might think that looks really beautiful, that's not for everybody. And I wanted to create these designs where you could walk into it and you wouldn't even know that it was a productive garden. You wouldn't even know that the main thing that it was designed for was food growing, because it just looked so beautiful. And I think when I had my previous garden, I would take people to look around this sort of very wild forest garden on part of the small holding. And people really love the concept, the idea of this kind of real ecosystem growing, creating all this habitat for wildlife and sort of being able to go around and forage. But It wasn't until I came back to our small yard by the house where I'd used exactly the same principles, but I'd done them on a smaller scale, but with more attractive, beautiful plants that people were like, yes, I could put this in my garden. Now I can see how I can take that concept of a forest garden and I can actually apply it in my own garden. And I say, and not even necessarily having to have those tree layers. So permaculture is very much about taking that inspiration from nature. And so that's very much what I wanted this book to be about. Forest gardening is very much about just taking inspiration from a forest, but actually most of our gardens are far from a forest. So I wanted to take that sort of natural inspiration and to put that into a book.
It's good as well that they're multifunctional, some of them, because you could have an edible garden on a small or a large scale, but you might struggle, I think, sometimes to find all plants that perform on a visual level and perform in terms of behaving themselves in the garden and also taste good. And that is one of the sticking points for a lot of people. They'll say, oh yeah, well, I can put that in. It is edible, but I don't necessarily want to eat it. But if you open that up and you say, okay, well, I've put that in and technically it's edible, but I don't want to eat it, but it performs this other function, then you don't have to be slavish and you can kind of play around with the plants.
Yeah, I think for me, planting design and gardening, it is all about experimentation and having fun. And I think that particularly like with my YouTube channel as well, is what I always say is that not to be afraid to put things in, not to worry about, is this the exact right plant for the right place? Because you won't necessarily know until you put it in and you try it out. And the same in terms of trying things, eating them, actually tasting them and testing them out. You won't necessarily be able to know if you like the taste of Good King Henry until you grow it, because where else are you likely to be able to go and pick it and eat it for dinner? So I just think my book really encourages this idea of gardening and growing as being an experiment. Permaculture is all about trying something out and observing it and then making adjustments or changes based on that sort of experiment. So if you plant some things in your garden and some of them don't taste nice, then just, dig them out and put something else in and try that, and don't see it as a failure. Just see it as part of your learning about things that you like. I mean, I personally don't particularly like Good King Henry. I know other people that do. I much prefer the Caucasian spinach, the Herblitzia. But, I didn't know that at the very beginning when I was designing my first ever forest garden. It took, a few years of growing things, trying them and finding different ways that I like to eat them for me to feel like, I have a successful list of plants that I know that I'm going to like eating in my garden.
So that in your own garden is fine. If you were working as a professional and you had a client and you said, oh, I'm going to do a bit of experimentation in your garden, they might be a bit horrified because it might mean they need to replace things further down the line. I mean, how do you sell that sort of experimental aspect into clients when you're working for them?
I think I'm just lucky that and I suppose I do pick and choose clients a bit maybe, but I think I'm just lucky that the clients that I have are very much open to this idea of it's an experiment, it's an ever-evolving thing. It's not just a case of, plant this and it'll stay like that forever, which is true of any garden design. But I think very much I focus on this idea that the garden and the client are, it's very much about that relationship between the two, and even more so than an ornamental garden where, it's not likely to matter too much if there's a couple of plants that you don't really like the look of, or they're not, your favourites. But when you're creating a productive garden, and particularly in a small space where you're trying to get the most you can out of that garden, you don't sort of want to waste a lot of space with something that you don't really like eating, unless, like you say, it also is a great plant for pollinator, or, it fixes nitrogen or something like that, then that's fine. But I think it's just about, in my book, that mostly is for home growers, so maybe they're less experienced. But I think it's just about having that conversation with clients at the beginning. And if they're not really very happy to do much experimenting, then just go with some more well-known edibles, black currants and rhubarb and gooseberries and, the oregano, things that they are more likely to use than filling it full of weird and wonderful but really bitter and fibrous plants.
Yeah, good point. And you do pick some really excellent plants in the book that you use as examples. There are some that are very unusual, and I thought, they look great. And if you've tried them out and, they kind of, as you say, every garden, every site is individual. But are there any sort of really unusual ones that you've used that you think, yes, I would include that in a design because it's such a showstopper or it's such a good performer?
I've been working with these plants so long, it's hard for me to remember which would be classed as unusual. I think some of my favourite in terms of actually really tasty are things like the Japanese wineberry. So that is really, the taste is absolutely amazing. But also it is a really beautiful plant. I mean, if you have the space for it or you train it against a wall, it's actually a really pretty plant. And even in winter, the stems have these really tiny little thorns on them that kind of glow red in the sunlight, in the winter sunlight. So it's a really beautiful plant. So Japanese wineberry is one that I would definitely include. And then other things like the perennial kale, Taunton Dean kale. That is one of my most used plants because it's really tough. It seems to fare much better with caterpillar attacks than other kales. But it's got these beautiful purple midribs as well. And so quite often I will plant it, and I'll plant other shades of purple with things like maybe aqualegias and juga and things like that for pollinators. But it just really sort of brings out the purple in the stems. So I really like to grow that, and it does taste beautiful as well. It's got quite tough leaves, but when you cook them they just go really sort of very melt in the mouth, as opposed to some kales that can be a bit sort of chewy and fibrous. And so there's quite a lot of, I'd say Herblitzia is one of my favorites, a Caucasian spinach, and it's a climbing plant as well, and it grows, it almost prefers semi-shade. And so actually to have a climbing plant that likes the shade and it's productive, I think is actually really valuable.
Yeah, and are some of these things difficult to source?
They can be, yes. I mean, I think that the demand for these plants has just risen so much that nurseries can't keep up with them. I'm really sad that we don't have our own nursery anymore because I absolutely loved running a nursery, but it is hard and the profit margins are small. And so I think it's more and more nurseries are sticking to sort of, plants that they know they can sell en masse. And so I think that we still haven't got quite enough places in the UK that are growing these unusual edible plants to meet the demand, because that's the thing that I get asked the most all the time is, where can I source these plants? And like when we were looking for Taunton Dean kale, we ended up having to get ours from eBay because at the time we couldn't find a nursery that had it in stock.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I have to say, when I sort of meet people with edible gardens, they're very generous. A lot of people will kind of, give cuttings away and stuff. And I suppose the more people that do it, the more that will grow and grow. But there are also some really sort of fairly commonplace plants in your book that you champion as real good performers and good edibles. Are there any that particularly come to mind on that front?
I think just, even just really common things like an alpine strawberry, it can get a bit invasive, but in the right place, it's just, there's nothing better for me than just picking the small fruits and eating those. And things like, there's a golden oregano, which I grow a lot, and it's not a wildly exciting or unusual plant, but it's just a real staple that I put in so much, whether I'm putting it in an omelette or adding it to salads or drying it to keep for winter, for sprinkling on top of a pizza. Just some of these really common plants that I just use all the time, and just having them growing in my garden in a system that is really great for wildlife. It's just so much better than going to the supermarket and buying them in a pot, having them been grown somewhere under grow lights and with added heat and all of the waste that goes with that. It's just great to have them at home.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about the kind of design aspect of the book. And I think a lot of people, when they get a design book, they look at it and they think, okay, well, I need a blank canvas in order to achieve this, or, in order to have some way of putting in a coherent design scheme. If you didn't want to do that, is permaculture something you could introduce piecemeal?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of my favourite permaculture principles is actually small and slow solutions. So instead of totally ripping out your existing planting and starting from scratch, which then also, not only is it loads of hard work and then you've got to buy in loads of plants all at once, so it's a big investment, it also takes away a lot of wildlife habitat all in one go. So actually, one approach that I suggest quite often is a kind of swapping in and out approach. So it's kind of like a slow transition, really. So go around your garden and look at plants that either are not doing well in your garden, or maybe you just really have never really liked them, and actually taking those plants out and swapping them for other plants. So maybe there's a shrub that you're not particularly keen on. You could take that out and swap in a blackcurrant, or maybe there's some herbaceous plants that you didn't like. You could take those out and put in something like a daylily, which has edible petals and leaves, or at the back of a border you could put in a Jerusalem artichoke. It's just about taking like these small steps, and if you did that over the course of sort of 4, 5, 6 years, you might just wake up one morning and realize that you have an entirely edible, beautiful garden, but it's just happened in a really slow and carefully thought out way.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Sometimes it's difficult to get in your head what a permaculture garden might look like. So apart from your book and, obviously the spaces you've created, which may not be open to the public, are there any really good examples that you would suggest people go and have a look at to get an idea or feel for it?
There's a really fantastic forest garden in the walled garden at RHS Bridgewater, which I really love. I think it's just so natural and beautiful. There's the Apricot Centre if you're further down south, and they had a beautiful edible garden that was at Chelsea last year, I think it was. So that's a great example. And also, as I say, on my YouTube channel, I actually made one of my episodes was called, I can't remember the name of the video, but it was me basically visiting 6 small-scale forest gardens, and just to show the variety that you can get from anything from really wild, with nettles and all sorts growing in there as well, to actually you wouldn't even know that it was a permaculture garden, because the only thing that really, in my mind, makes it different is that a permaculture garden is much more about creating space for nature, about the plants having some useful yield for us as well. And about creating it in a way that doesn't damage the planet or, take advantage of exploiting people within its making. But it can look exactly like a regular garden. Many people might have gardens which would be classed as a permaculture garden, but maybe they've just never thought of it in that way.
Yeah, very good point. So just thinking about the wildlife element of it, I mean, how useful are permaculture gardens in terms of habitat for wildlife?
Yeah, I think that habitat is such an important part of a permaculture garden, because it's all about this idea of fair shares. When we think of a garden, quite often we just think about what we can get from it, and we forget that actually that space is home to a vast array of other animals and creatures and insects and all sorts of things. And actually, how can we provide for them as well? And so in gardens that I'm creating, I think, and I made this same mistake in a way when I first got into permaculture gardening. I was just thinking about what yields, what edible things can I put in for me? And it's only really over my many years of learning that I've realised that actually quite often I start with, what can I do for the wildlife? So in gardens that I'm creating now, I'm putting in log piles, I'm putting in stone piles, a pond wherever possible, even if it's only really small, making sure that I leave piles of dead leaves, adding in dead hedges. And actually all of these features can be made to look really nice as well. So in one garden, I've created a stone pile, but it's actually in a spiral shape. So it looks kind of like a garden feature more than just a habitat pile. In my garden at home, I've got a 6-foot dead hedge, which is actually hiding a really ugly fence, but is also amazing habitat for wildlife. So there's ways that we can introduce this habitat, but in a way that also looks really nice, rather than just thinking, oh, I don't really want a pile of messy logs or branches in my garden.
Thank you to Pippa for coming back on the podcast and for sharing your knowledge. And thanks to you as always for listening. If you like this episode, you might also like episode 185, Food Forests for Plant Lovers with Pippa, and episode 296, Regenerative Design. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.